So we move to Chapter 17, e-business, e-marketing, and IT controls. Let's take a look at the first section, which really concerns definitions. Let's be clear on the difference between e-business and e-commerce. Often when you look online, these words tend to be used sort of interchangeably, but strictly speaking, in terms of e-business, we're simply talking about sort of automating a business via internet technologies. Note that e-commerce is the transaction, in other words, conducting business, let's say buying or indeed selling over the internet. You may buy goods, etc., from Amazon. So that's an example of e-commerce. Now, in terms of the possible models, there are a variety, and I'm sure that you're familiar with them. When we think about a business model, we're just simply talking about the way in which, let's say, a product is sold or a business is organized to deliver a service. And indeed, the information flows between the supplier and indeed the customer, obviously resulting in revenue. Now, obviously, this has changed over time. The internet's had a massive impact. These are just some examples. So, for example, let's say a brokerage, really market makers. So in the UK, something like, let's say, Gumtree, which is bringing buyers and sellers together, or perhaps a car website where you can register, buy a car, or interact with the seller. The other side might be something like advertising, Gmail, etc., services being provided for free with pop-up ads, etc. Okay, so those are just two examples. Now, moving from there, when we think about the IT side, in other words, the infrastructure, as it were, in terms of the advent of the internet, several impacts upon businesses. Obviously, the use of browsers, internet browsers, Google, Bing, etc., and indeed the use of devices. In addition to that, obviously, websites, web applications, and indeed technology. Outside of that, in terms of Chaffey's model, now for me, Chaffey's model is quite detailed and it's a little bit old. It comes from 2009. In essence, what Chaffey says is that businesses, when they build their infrastructure, in other words, their hardware and indeed software, should consider each of these layers in this 5-layer. Now, for me, with the SBL exam, this is a little bit over the top in terms of information. But I mean, broadly speaking, what he's talking about is level 1 being sort of CRM or customer relationship management. In other words, the way that you manage your relationships between, let's say, a supplier and or a customer. Moving from there, we're talking about the web browsers and the service software and standards. Then really the hardware, the physical network, and indeed the means through which you transfer data. Outside of that, we talk about the storage, i.e. storage of data relating to customers, suppliers, etc. And then the last area is really the customer's data, the content, or indeed the data layer. As I say, I think this model is very, very detailed, and I don't think that you'll see reference to it within an SBL exam answer, a little bit over the top. What he does say elsewhere, though, is quite useful. More of that in a moment. Now, in terms of an internet, if you're working, you will have access, I would suspect, to an intranet, in effect, an in-house version, owned and run by a single organization, which shares information organization-wide. Okay. Now, in terms of marketing, we're familiar with the concept. I mean, we know that marketing is essentially understanding customers' needs and indeed fulfilling those needs with messages, etc., in relation to a product or a service. Now, what Chaffey says here is definitely more relevant and quite useful, I think. We're really talking about the difference between marketing today and perhaps traditional marketing 20, 30 years ago. And he uses the 6 I's. Each of the I's here is definitely relevant, and this is useful. I would learn these 6 I's absolutely. We've seen questions on this area for sure. Let me run you down what Chaffey says in terms of impact. So first things first, interactivity. Obviously, the use of the internet allows more dialogue, more chat, more content between a company and indeed its customers than obviously the traditional approach. So interactivity. Now, given interactivity, obviously more information is available, or if you will, intelligence. So the internet provides an organization with a way to collect extremely useful information about you, about me, etc. Now, given the collection of the information, what the internet also allows for is to sort of customize. In other words, to use information to target particular users in particular ways. Outside of that, this is a key point here. The internet is only one area. Businesses today need to integrate the use of the internet with other media, i.e. mail, phone, etc., etc. Next area is restructuring. Obviously, the use of the internet for business, has changed the way that many businesses operate. So, for example, this word is important, disintermediation. In a sense, what we're talking about is skipping, let's say, a supplier. In other words, some businesses being able to go directly to the customer and circumventing a third party. Disintermediation. Try and remember that. Last area, I believe, is location, or indeed independence of location. Obviously, the internet allows businesses to reach massive worldwide markets on the basis that they can actually deliver the good or indeed the service. Okay, so those 6 I's definitely important to us. Now, what's also important, obviously, if you're trading on the internet, if you're conducting e-business, as it were, is your brand. What do we mean by a brand? Well, in essence, some form of name or mark or design, etc., that sort of differentiates you, your products or your service from your competitors. Now, in terms of e-branding, we're simply looking at that online. So how do you manage, or how can you manage better online brands? I mean, you know yourself, you have favorite websites that you buy from, and many of these things will be relevant in terms of your search for a particular product or indeed a service. Certainly the look and feel of the website, SEO or search engine optimization, which is becoming more and more complex as each year passes. The idea that use of keywords, use of phraseology, etc. Blogs obviously have been around for some time. And indeed, outside of that, obviously, social media alongside email campaigns. Although personally, I do find some of the email campaigns a little bit annoying, nearly too much. I think less is more when you're talking about content or contact with a particular brand, as it were. Okay, so moving from there, we're going to deal with managing suppliers and indeed customers. Now, first things first, when we think of SCM, this is a term that you're familiar with. We're simply talking about the flow of goods and services from origin, I guess, to consumption. And we know what impact the internet has had on the relationships that businesses have. Some examples to follow just now. One is procurement. So really, EDI, you'll be familiar with this. We're talking about linked systems. So the idea that you may, as a business, be linked with several suppliers, thus facilitating better communication. Other than that, certainly ERP systems, and managing all aspects of a business. So in terms of e-procurement, or indeed the buying function of businesses, certainly automating that and using the internet provides a number of advantages, as we'll see here. Really real-time information. So if you're a supplier, if you're using EDI, let's say, or e-procurement, then obviously you will be closer to the action, aware of your customers' needs. Outside of that, it certainly allows for compliance or better compliance. In other words, using e-procurement allows you to be more efficient, and indeed for the customer to be more efficient. Certainly speed, shorter order and delivery time, and indeed outside of that, the monitoring, let's say, of suppliers and indeed their product portfolio, it just makes things easier all around, having that close tie and relationship. But there are downsides also. And in terms of major downsides, obviously information, the idea that a supplier can take advantage of a customer because they know more about the customer. In addition to that, the possibility of mistakes. Outside of that, maybe the software could be glitchy. And key point, maybe the most important thing, is confidentiality and indeed security. Outside of that, certainly the supply chain problems as e-sourcing speeds up the sourcing process in one sense. It may well be that we build in inefficiencies in some way, shape, or form. Okay, moving on to our next section, relationships. We've talked a little bit about suppliers, EDI, etc., and indeed e-procurement. So that's one side. What about our customers? How can we build good relationships? Well, obviously being available in relation to queries, feeding back quickly, and certainly having access to customers in terms of registration, email, opt-in, etc. So this brings us to sort of CRM, or the management of this area. So basically what CRM does, as you'll probably be aware, is basically manage all relevant data in relation to customers, e.g. purchasing history. Perhaps a good example of that would be something like Amazon, or possibly if you use Netflix, you'll see reference to the use of big data and analytics in that area. In terms of acquisition of customers, note the difference between acquisition and, as we'll see in a moment, retaining. First things first, we simply mean using a website, your website, to make leads, to generate leads. And indeed, outside of that, maybe encouraging people that haven't used the internet before to purchase via e-commerce. In terms of methods in this particular area, obviously SEO, search engine, social media, social networks, and indeed email marketing, as we saw at the beginning of this mind map. Now, there's a difference between acquiring a customer and indeed keeping them. And the key point here, I think, in terms of Parasinomon, is quality. In other words, how do you maintain quality? Quite a few things. I mean, first things first, the website itself. There's nothing more frustrating than using a website that has glitches, or that is difficult to book, or it's difficult to navigate. Outside of that, obviously, reliability, downtime is a big problem. Responding, as we said up top, to customers, to email inquiries quickly helps. In addition to that, obviously, the attitude and indeed ability of employees, and indeed outside of that, personal attention, caring, empathy. Okay. Moving on to this next section, security controls. Why do we need controls? Because there are so many threats to systems, not least simple ones as in poor data processing, but obviously unauthorized access, possible changes, natural disasters, etc. So any system is subject to a variety of different threats from so many different sources. So we need to protect it. We need controls. First set of controls, think broad controls. So we're talking general, the policies and procedures that make or that relate to applications, and indeed support in an overall sense the functioning of, as we'll see in a moment, application controls. Outside of that, when we think about frameworks and a number, for example, written policies. Outside of that, probably considering duties, i.e. the idea that you would segregate particular duties. Along with that, good quality and indeed regular high-level training for staff. That's going to add to the mix. Now, the difference between general and indeed application more detailed. We're talking about manual or automated procedures at the process level. Could be preventative or indeed detective in nature. And really, we're talking about the sort of integrity or protecting the integrity of that processing side. In terms of the control framework here, a number of things that can be done, obviously on the input or data input side, processing side, access, etc., checking output, and indeed, the standing data, key stored data. Moving from there, in terms of assets, really, what businesses need to do is to have a systematic approach to all-round security, not just in terms of IS, but also obviously IT. One key point is management taking it seriously, top management, buy-in, and indeed a culture, organization-wide culture that focuses on the problem. Certainly a consideration of risks, and outside that, obviously, vigilance. In terms of risk assessment, certainly, as we've seen within the risk chapters, we need to analyze carefully individual risks that relate to IT and IS. And there are many, not least downtime, but obviously, given IS, IT fraud, theft, or possible breaches in terms of regulations. In terms of system failure control, I mean, what can we do? You know, how can we avoid it? Well, it can't be avoided entirely. Several things could be considered. The design, in terms of the overall system design, you know, outside of that, you know, routine procedures, you know, training, and indeed, right at the end there, contingency planning. So a plan if things go wrong. Moving on from there, in terms of security controls, do take a look at the text on this, but quite a few different areas here. Let's be familiar with the terminology. Again, as we said up top, so many threats, therefore so many controls are required, both physical, logical, and indeed, you know, in terms of overall access. Moving from there, in terms of the data, you know, we'll be collecting a lot of data. So we'll have disks, folders, etc. How do we protect? Variety of options, not least passwords, encryption, etc., and indeed auditing, checking. In terms of contingency planning, if things go wrong, certainly procedures that need to be put into place immediately, you know, survival, and the idea that if ops are down, we need to get them up to speed as quickly as possible. And outside of that, point number 3, certainly personnel need to be aware. Everyone needs to know what they need to do in the case of a system going down or being hacked, etc. Next area here for us is cybersecurity. Now, we know that this is a popular topic. The whole area of cyber crime, cyber threats, etc., and safeguards has come up several times in the SBL exam since September 2018. I mean, obviously, one of the reasons here is it's very, very topical. You only have to look online to see the number of cyber attacks over the course of the last 1 or 2 years, and significant attacks, absolutely. So really, any unauthorized access, broadly speaking, to access information is an attack. You know, common threats that many and varied, you know, the theft of information, the theft of data, possible theft of assets, certainly, you know, denial of use or disrupting operations, downtime, etc., or possibly unauthorized disclosure. And there are several examples of that, certainly, in the last year or two. In terms of, bear with me 1 second, in terms of, you know, guarding against those areas, several things that businesses can do, and everything really centers around focusing on security. You know, the regime, the attitude towards risk, and this will tie in with what we said up top in terms of buy-in from management and management pushing this agenda. In terms of secure configuration, we're talking about checking, making sure that vulnerable areas are checked on. Outside of that, when we think about access, obviously the internet provides a means or a mode of access, so we need to be careful about that. And then in terms of privileges, people only be able to access what's relevant to them and nothing else. So what should CFOs do? Well, certainly as we saw up top, they need to take this seriously. They need to take a broad view of IT and IS and problems associated. It's not just technical, it's a major business problem. So, you know, obviously redefining risk and being resilient, making sure that we have recovery plans, being careful, as we said up top, when we're linking into the supply chain, e.g. with as well, being careful of that area, and certainly consideration of cyber insurance to cover ourselves. Okay, so that includes everything that we need to have a fix on in relation to Chapter 17. I hope that you found that helpful and that your studies are going well. Thanks for listening.